New York City, November 2024, 11:47 p.m. The rain hammered against the cracked pavement of Brooklyn's industrial district like bullets from an invisible war. Grace Turner pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the cold seep through the worn fabric as she stepped out of Rosie's diner. The neon sign above flickered weakly. Rosie's Diner. Half the letters had died months ago, just like the hope in this neighborhood. Her shift had been brutal. 12 hours on her feet, dealing with truckers who left pocket change as tips and businessmen who thought a smile entitled them to her phone number. Grace's sneakers squeaked against the wet concrete as she counted the crumpled bills in her apron pocket. $43. Barely enough to cover this week's groceries, let alone the overdue rent notice taped to her apartment door. At 26 years old, Grace had learned that life in New York wasn't the glittering dream sold in movies. It was gritty, unforgiving, and shaped by a simple rule: mind your own business and survive another day. The streets were deserted at this hour. Yellow taxi cabs splashed through puddles, their headlights cutting through the downpour like searchlights. Grace walked quickly toward the subway station 3 blocks away, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid November air. The smell of rain mixing with garbage and exhaust filled her lungs, a scent so familiar, it had become her version of normal. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of urban decay around her. Crying. Grace stopped mid-step, water soaking through her already damp socks. She turned her head, scanning the shadows between the buildings. There, near the corner of Warehouse Street and Fifth Avenue, a small figure stood frozen under a broken streetlight. A child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, wearing an expensive-looking dark coat that seemed entirely out of place in this forgotten part of Brooklyn. "Hey," Grace called out, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of a delivery truck barreling down the street. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, tears streaming down his pale face, staring at something Grace couldn't see. His little hands were clenched into fists at his sides, trembling. Grace's instincts screamed at her to keep walking. This wasn't her problem. Getting involved in other people's business in New York, especially in this neighborhood, was a dangerous game. But something about the child's frozen terror struck a chord deep in her chest. She remembered being that scared once, a long time ago, when her own world had collapsed. She took a step toward him. That's when she saw the SUV. A black Escalade. Windows tinted darker than midnight came roaring around the corner at a speed that was absolutely reckless for a residential area. The driver wasn't slowing down. The child stood directly in its path, seemingly unable to move, paralyzed by fear or confusion. Time collapsed into a single crystallized moment. Grace didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of safety. She exploded into motion, her worn sneakers pounding against the wet asphalt as she sprinted toward the boy. Rain lashed at her face. Her lungs burned. The SUV's headlights grew brighter, closer, the engine's growl becoming a mechanical roar that promised destruction. 5 feet away. 4. 3. Grace's hand shot out and grabbed the boy's arm, yanking him backward with every ounce of strength she possessed. They tumbled together onto the sidewalk, Grace's body instinctively shielding the child as the Escalade screamed past, missing them by inches. The vehicle's side mirror clipped a trash can, sending it spinning into the air with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty street. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged animal. Her palms were scraped raw from the concrete, blood mixing with rainwater and dirt. But she was alive, and more importantly, so was the boy. "Are you okay?" Grace gasped, rolling off him and checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" The child stared at her with wide, dark eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. He didn't answer, just continued to tremble, his small body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Behind them, the Escalade's brake lights flared red. The vehicle screeched to a halt 50 yards down the street. Grace's blood turned to ice. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from this distance, Grace could see he was built like a freight train. Broad shoulders, shaved head, wearing a dark suit that screamed, "Trouble." He started walking back toward them with purposeful strides that made Grace's survival instincts scream. "Come on," she whispered urgently to the boy, trying to pull him to his feet. "We need to go. Now." But the child didn't move. He just kept staring at the approaching man, and for the first time Grace noticed something strange. The boy wasn't looking at the man with fear. It was something else. Recognition. The bald man stopped 10 feet away, his hand moving toward something inside his jacket. Grace's body tensed, preparing to run, to fight, to do whatever it took to protect this child she didn't even know. "Step away from the boy," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "He almost got hit by your car," Grace shot back, anger temporarily overriding her fear. "You were driving like a maniac." The man's expression didn't change. "That vehicle wasn't supposed to be on this route. He paused, studying Grace with eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in seconds. "You saved him." "I did what anyone would do," Grace replied, still positioned protectively in front of the child. "No," the man said quietly, and something in his tone made Grace's skin prickle. "You didn't." Before Grace could respond, 3 more SUVs appeared from different directions, surrounding them like chess pieces moving into position. Doors opened simultaneously, and men in similar dark suits emerged, each one radiating the kind of danger that Grace had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. What had she just walked into? One of the men approached the bald one and whispered something in his ear. Grace watched as the bald man's expression shifted slightly, a crack in his professional mask. He looked back at Grace, then at the boy, then pulled out a phone and made a call. "Sir," he said into the device, his voice suddenly carrying a weight that suggested he was reporting to someone very important. "We have a situation. Your son is safe, but there's been an incident." Grace's mind raced. "Your son?" This child belonged to someone powerful enough to have an armed convoy searching for him in the middle of the night. The bald man listened to whoever was on the other end, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Finally, he lowered the phone and looked at Grace with an expression that was equal parts respect and warning. "Mr. Blackwell wants to meet you," he said. "Who's Mr. Blackwell?" Grace asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. The man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The person whose son you just saved, and the person you should probably be very careful around." The boy finally spoke, his voice small and fragile. "I want Daddy." Grace looked down at him, seeing the exhaustion and fear written across his features, and felt her heart break a little. Whatever world this child came from, he was still just a scared kid who wanted his father. "Okay," Grace said softly, making a decision that would change her life forever. "Let's get you to your dad." As the men formed a protective circle around them and guided them toward one of the waiting SUVs, Grace caught a glimpse of her reflection in the vehicle's tinted window. She looked exactly like what she was, a tired waitress who'd stumbled into something far bigger than herself. Her wet hair clung to her face, her cheap jacket was torn, and blood from her scraped palms left rust-colored stains on her jeans. She had no idea who Adrian Blackwell was. She had no idea that his name was whispered with fear in boardrooms and back alleys across the East Coast. She had no idea that the Black Mafia was real, powerful, and unforgiving. And she had absolutely no idea that saving one small boy on a rainy November night would pull her into a world where loyalty was currency, violence was language, and survival meant making impossible choices. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Grace looked back at Rosie's diner disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. Her normal life, her safe, predictable, struggling but honest life, was vanishing behind her, and something told her she wouldn't be going back anytime soon. Manhattan, Blackwell Tower, 12:43 a.m. The SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan like a predator cutting through dark water. Grace sat in the back seat. The boy pressed against her side, his small hand clutching the fabric of her jacket. She'd tried asking his name twice, but he'd only stared at her with those haunting dark eyes before burying his face against her shoulder. Outside the tinted windows, Brooklyn's industrial wasteland transformed into something else entirely. Towering glass buildings pierced the night sky, their windows glowing like thousands of watchful eyes. This was the Manhattan Grace only saw in photographs, the one reserved for people who didn't count tips to make rent. "Where are we going?" Grace finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. The bald man in the passenger seat, she'd heard another guard call him Marcus, glanced back at her through the rearview mirror. "Mr. Blackwell's private residence, Blackwell Tower, Midtown." Grace had heard of Blackwell Tower. Everyone in New York had. It was one of those ultra-luxury buildings where apartments started at $15 million. The kind of place where doormen wore better suits than most CEOs. She'd walked past it once 2 years ago, feeling like an alien observing a different species. "And Mr. Blackwell, what does he do?" Grace asked, though her instincts were already screaming warnings. Marcus's lips curved into something that might have been amusement. "Mr. Blackwell is a businessman. Import-export, real estate, various investments." The way he said it made it clear these were rehearsed answers. a script designed to sound legitimate while revealing absolutely nothing. The SUV turned onto a private drive flanked by security checkpoints that looked more appropriate for a military installation than a residential building. Guards in tactical gear examined the vehicle even though they clearly recognized it. One of them made eye contact with Marcus and nodded. Some silent communication that Grace couldn't interpret. The underground garage they entered was spotless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that reflected off rows of luxury vehicles. Bentleys, Maseratis. A vintage Aston Martin that probably cost more than Grace would earn in 10 lifetimes. Each one parked with mathematical precision, like soldiers standing at attention. "This way," Marcus said as the SUV came to a stop. Grace stepped out, still holding the boy's hand. Her cheap sneakers squeaked against the polished concrete floor, a sound that seemed to announce her poverty to everyone present. She counted at least 8 security personnel positioned throughout the garage, all watching her with expressions that suggested they were calculating exactly how dangerous she might be. Not very, Grace thought bitterly, unless you consider unpaid bills a weapon. They entered a private elevator with mirrors on all sides. Grace caught sight of herself, truly saw herself, and almost flinched. She looked like she'd been in a fight. Her brown hair hung in wet tangles around her face. Mascara ran in dark streams down her cheeks. Her jacket was ripped at the elbow and dried blood stained her palms and jeans. Next to the impeccably dressed guards, she looked like something the city had chewed up and spit out. The boy was still clinging to her, though. That counted for something. The elevator rose silently, numbers climbing on a digital display. 45, 50, 55. It didn't stop until it reached 60, the penthouse level. When the doors opened, Grace stepped into a world she'd only seen in movies. The penthouse was vast, an open-concept space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The city sparkled below like a carpet of diamonds scattered across black velvet. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the lights into abstract paintings. The interior was decorated in dark woods and leather, with artwork that Grace suspected was worth more than her entire neighborhood. But Grace barely noticed the luxury. Her attention was fixed on the man standing by the windows, his back to them, silhouette outlined against the glittering cityscape. Even before he turned around, Grace could feel the power radiating from him. It was in the way he stood, perfectly still, yet somehow suggesting coiled violence. It was in the way every person in the room unconsciously oriented themselves toward him, like planets orbiting a dark sun. "Daddy!" the boy cried out, breaking free from Grace's hand and running across the marble floor. The man turned, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. Adrian Blackwell was not what she'd expected. Media photos, the few that existed, showed a cold, corporate figure in expensive suits. But those images had been sanitized, edited, made safe for public consumption. The real Adrian Blackwell was something else entirely. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved from granite. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the low light. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked with scars that told stories of violence. Everything about him screamed danger, controlled, calculated, lethal danger. But when the boy crashed into him, something in that severe face transformed. Adrian dropped to one knee, gathering his son into his arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that Grace suspected had done terrible things. "Elijah," Adrian murmured, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Daddy," the boy, Elijah, whispered. "The lady saved me. The car was coming and she grabbed me and—" "I know," Adrian said quietly, pulling back to examine his son for injuries. "I know. You're safe now." Grace stood frozen near the elevator, acutely aware of Marcus and 3 other guards positioned around the room. She felt like an intruder in a private moment, but there was nowhere to go, no graceful way to disappear. After what felt like an eternity, Adrian stood, lifting Elijah in his arms. Only then did he turn his full attention to Grace, and the weight of that gaze nearly made her step backward. He studied her with an intensity that felt invasive, as if he could see through her skin into her very thoughts. Those dark eyes traveled from her wet hair to her torn jacket, to her bloodied hands, cataloging every detail. Grace forced herself to meet his stare, refusing to look away despite every instinct screaming at her to show submission. "Marcus," Adrian said, never breaking eye contact with Grace. "Take Elijah to his room. Have Dr. Chen examine him, then bring her back here." "Yes, sir," Marcus responded immediately. "No," Elijah protested, clinging tighter to his father. "I want to stay with the lady." "Her name is Grace," Adrian said, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine. He already knew her name. Of course he did. He'd probably known everything about her within minutes of Marcus's phone call. "Grace needs to talk with Daddy for a few minutes. Then maybe you can see her again. Okay?" Elijah looked uncertain but finally nodded. As Marcus gently took him from Adrian's arms, the boy looked back at Grace. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saving me." Grace's heart clenched. "You're welcome, sweetheart." When they disappeared down a hallway, the atmosphere in the room changed. The guards remained at their posts, but Grace could feel their attention sharpening. Whatever was about to happen, they were ready for violence. Adrian walked to a bar area in the corner of the room, poured 2 glasses of what looked like very expensive scotch, and brought one to Grace. She took it automatically, her hands trembling slightly. "Sit," Adrian said, gesturing to a leather couch. It wasn't a request. Grace sat, her wet clothes probably ruining the leather that likely cost more than her car. Adrian remained standing, looking down at her with that same intense scrutiny. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Everything." So Grace did. She described leaving work, hearing Elijah crying, seeing the SUV bearing down on him. She left nothing out, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence filled the space between them. "Do you know who I am?" Adrian finally asked. "No," Grace admitted, "but I'm guessing you're someone important, and probably dangerous." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Adrian's face. An honest answer, rare in my world. He took a drink of his scotch. "My son wandered away from his security detail tonight. A mistake that will be addressed. He could have died on that street. Instead, he's alive because a waitress from Brooklyn decided to risk her own life for a stranger. Any decent person would have done the same thing," Grace said. "No," Adrian replied, his voice hard. "They wouldn't. I've learned that lesson repeatedly." He paused, studying her again. "You're afraid of me right now, I can see it. But you're hiding it well. Why?" Grace met his gaze. "Because showing fear to dangerous people usually makes things worse." Adrian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're smarter than you look." "Thanks, I think," Grace muttered. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. Adrian set down his glass with careful precision. Grace Turner, 26 years old, works at Rosie's Diner in Brooklyn, lives alone in a studio apartment on Maple Street. No criminal record, no family in the area. Student loan debt from a degree you never finished. Medical bills from— "Stop," Grace interrupted, her voice sharp. "I get it. You know everything about me. Congratulations. I need to know who saved my son," Adrian said simply, "and whether that person poses a threat." "A threat?" Grace laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "Look at me. I'm a broke waitress who can barely afford groceries. What kind of threat could I possibly be to someone like you?" "The worst kind," Adrian said quietly. "The innocent bystander who saw something they shouldn't have, who might talk to police, or journalists, or anyone else interested in my business." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Grace understood what he was implying, what he might do to protect his secrets. "I'm not going to tell anyone anything," Grace said carefully. "I don't even know what there is to tell. I saved a kid, that's all." "That's all," Adrian repeated, as if testing the words. He turned back to the windows, hands clasped behind his back. "You entered my world tonight, Grace. That's not something people usually walk away from unchanged." Grace stood, anger overriding her fear. "Then I'm leaving. Right now. Thanks for the drink and the vague threats, but I'm done." She made it 3 steps toward the elevator before Adrian spoke again. $500,000. Grace stopped. "That's what I'm offering you," Adrian continued, "for saving Elijah's life. No strings attached. Tax-free. Cash. You can walk away tonight, take the money, and never see me again. All I ask is your silence about what you saw and where you've been." Grace's mind reeled. $500,000, enough to erase her debts, enough to start over, enough to finally breathe. "Why?" she asked, not turning around. "Because gratitude is a currency I rarely get to use," Adrian said, "and because you gave me back the only thing in this world that matters to me." Grace turned to face him. In the reflection of the windows, she could see his profile. Hard, dangerous, but also somehow lonely. A man who ruled an empire but lived in isolation. "What if I say no?" Grace asked. "Then you still leave with my gratitude and my protection," Adrian replied. "But not the money. The choice is yours." Grace looked at this man who terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. She thought about her crumbling apartment, her dying dreams, her exhausting life of barely surviving. She thought about Elijah's small hand in hers, and she thought about the warning in Adrian's words. "You entered my world tonight. I need to think about it," Grace said finally. Adrian nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Marcus will drive you home. You have until tomorrow night to decide. After that, the offer expires." As if summoned, Marcus appeared from the hallway. Grace followed him to the elevator, aware of Adrian's gaze on her back the entire time. Just before the doors closed, Adrian spoke one last time. "Grace." She looked up, meeting those dark, dangerous eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saving my son." The elevator doors closed, and Grace leaned against the mirrored wall, her heart racing. She'd just met the most dangerous man in New York, and somehow she knew this wouldn't be the last time. Brooklyn, Grace's apartment, 2:17 a.m. The ride back to Brooklyn felt like traveling between two different universes. Grace sat in silence as the SUV moved through Manhattan's glittering heart, then crossed into the darker, grittier reality of her neighborhood. Marcus hadn't spoken a word during the entire drive, but Grace felt his eyes checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, as if assessing whether she might suddenly become a problem. When they pulled up outside her building, a 5-story walk-up with crumbling brick and rusted fire escapes, the contrast was almost comical. The luxury vehicle looked like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong dimension. "Someone will contact you tomorrow," Marcus said as Grace opened the door. "To get your answer." Grace nodded, too exhausted to respond. She climbed out into the rain, which had softened to a steady drizzle, and watched the SUV disappear around the corner. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys at the building's entrance. The lock stuck. It always did. And Grace had to jiggle it 3 times before the door finally gave way. The hallway smelled like mildew and Mrs. Chen's cooking from 3B. Familiar, normal, safe. Grace climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment, her legs feeling like lead. Every muscle in her body ached from the adrenaline crash. She unlocked her door, another stubborn lock, and stepped into her tiny studio. 1 room. That's all it was. A kitchen area that was barely more than a hot plate and a mini fridge. A bathroom the size of a closet. A mattress on the floor because she couldn't afford a bed frame. Clothes hanging from a tension rod across one corner. Her entire life fit into 400 square feet of barely livable space. Grace peeled off her wet clothes and stepped into the shower, letting hot water wash away the dried blood, the rain, and the lingering scent of expensive scotch and leather. She watched pink-tinged water swirl down the drain and tried to process what had just happened. Adrian Blackwell. The name echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She'd lied earlier when she said she didn't know who he was. She'd heard whispers, of course, everyone in New York had. Adrian Blackwell was one of those names spoken in hushed tones. A legitimate businessman on the surface, but with rumors of darker dealings underneath. Import-export companies that moved more than cargo. Real estate developments that displaced entire communities overnight. Political connections that ran deeper than tree roots. And now he'd offered her $500,000 for her silence. Grace turned off the water and stood dripping in her cramped bathroom, staring at her reflection in the foggy mirror. She looked different somehow. The same face, the same tired eyes, but something had shifted. She'd crossed a line tonight, stepped through a door that might not have a way back. Her phone buzzed on the sink counter. Grace wrapped a towel around herself and checked the screen. Unknown number. Sleep well, Grace. Tomorrow changes everything. Her blood ran cold. How did they have her number? Of course they did. Adrian Blackwell knew everything about her. He probably knew her social security number, her blood type, and what she'd eaten for breakfast 3 years ago. Grace deleted the message and threw the phone onto her mattress. She needed sleep. Morning shift at Rosie's started in 6 hours, and she couldn't afford to miss work, regardless of what insanity her life had become. But sleep didn't come easily. Grace lay in the darkness, listening to sirens wail in the distance, and her neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls. Her mind kept replaying the moment she'd grabbed Elijah, that split-second decision that had changed everything. If she'd walked past, minded her own business like any sensible New Yorker, she'd still be just another invisible person struggling to survive. Instead, she'd saved the son of a crime lord. Allegedly, Grace reminded herself. She had no proof that Adrian Blackwell was anything other than what Marcus claimed, a businessman with good security. But her instincts screamed otherwise. The way those men moved, the way they watched everything, the way Adrian himself carried violence just beneath his polished surface. $500,000. The number haunted her. It represented freedom, security, a life where she didn't count every dollar or choose between groceries and electricity. She could finish her degree, move out of this hellhole, maybe even help other people the way she'd helped Elijah. But what was the real cost? What would accepting that money make her? A participant in whatever dark world Adrian Blackwell inhabited. Would she be able to live with herself? Grace finally drifted into restless sleep around 4 in the morning, her dreams filled with dark SUVs and darker eyes watching her from shadows. Rosie's Diner, 8:43 a.m. "You look like death warmed over," Rosie said when Grace stumbled into the diner for her morning shift. Rosie Martinez was 63, tough as nails, and had owned the diner for 30 years. She'd seen everything Brooklyn could throw at a person and had survived it all with her sense of humor intact. She was also the closest thing Grace had to family in this city. "Rough night," Grace muttered, tying her apron around her waist with hands that still showed scrapes from last night's pavement. "What happened to your hands?" Rosie asked, her dark eyes sharpening with concern. "I fell," Grace lied. "Slipped on the wet sidewalk leaving here last night." Rosie studied her for a long moment, clearly not believing the story, but having the grace not to push. "Well, you better get some coffee in you. We got the breakfast rush coming and Brenda called in sick again." The morning passed in a blur of burned toast, lukewarm coffee, and customers who treated Grace like a vending machine rather than a human being. She moved through her routine on autopilot, her mind elsewhere, jumping every time the door chimed to announce a new customer. She was waiting for them, whoever Adrian would send to get her answer. It happened during the lunch rush. Grace was refilling coffee for a table of construction workers when she felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched. She turned and saw him immediately. He sat alone in a corner booth, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that looked completely out of place in Rosie's worn vinyl and Formica atmosphere. He wasn't Marcus. This man was younger, maybe early 30s with sharp features and calculating eyes. He didn't pretend to look at a menu. He just watched Grace with the patience of a predator waiting for prey to come within striking distance. Grace's heart hammered, but she forced herself to walk over with her notepad and practiced smile. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," the man said. His voice was smooth, educated, with a faint accent Grace couldn't place. "And 5 minutes of your time." "I'm working," Grace replied. "Mr. Blackwell sent me," the man continued, ignoring her protest. "My name is Vincent. I'm here to facilitate your decision." Grace glanced around the diner. Rosie was handling the register. The cook was focused on the grill. No one was paying attention to them. She slid into the booth across from Vincent, keeping her hands visible on the table. "I haven't decided yet," Grace said. "Then let me help you decide," Vincent replied, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Open it." Grace hesitated, then pulled the envelope toward her. Inside were photographs. The first showed her apartment building. The second showed her walking to work. The third showed her having coffee with her friend Jenny 2 weeks ago. There were at least 20 photos documenting her life in intimate detail. "What is this?" Grace whispered, her voice tight with anger and fear. "Context," Vincent said calmly. "Mr. Blackwell needs you to understand the situation clearly. You've entered a world where information is power and silence is survival. These photos demonstrate that we know everything about you. Where you go, who you see, what matters to you." "Is that a threat?" Grace demanded. "It's reality," Vincent corrected. "Mr. Blackwell is offering you a generous payment for something simple, your silence about last night. But you need to understand what breaking that silence would mean, not just for you, but for anyone connected to you." Grace thought about Jenny, about Rosie, about the few people in her life who actually mattered. The message was clear: talk, and they suffer. "That's not fair," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "Fair?" Vincent's eyebrow rose. "Miss Turner, fairness is a luxury for people who live in safe worlds. You don't live in that world anymore. You saved Mr. Blackwell's son, which earned you his gratitude. But gratitude only extends so far. After that, there's only pragmatism." He pulled out a business card and set it on top of the envelope. "You have until 8 o'clock tonight. Call that number with your decision. If you accept, the money will be transferred immediately to an account we'll set up for you. If you refuse..." He paused meaningfully. Mr. Blackwell hopes you won't refuse. Vincent stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. One more thing, Miss Turner. Mr. Blackwell admires your courage. He sees something in you that he rarely sees in people. Don't disappoint him. With that, Vincent walked out of the diner, leaving Grace sitting alone with an envelope full of her own life staring back at her. Who was that? Rosie asked, appearing at Grace's elbow with the coffee pot. Wrong booth, Grace lied, shoving the envelope into her apron. Just some businessman who got confused. But Rosie's sharp eyes saw too much. Grace, honey, whatever's going on? Nothing's going on, Grace interrupted, standing abruptly. I need to use the bathroom. She locked herself in the small restroom, her hands gripping the sink as she stared at her reflection. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, unforgiving, showing every exhausted line on her face. $500,000. For her silence, for complicity in whatever Adrian Blackwell's world really was. Grace pulled out her phone and did what she should have done 12 hours ago. She searched Adrian Blackwell's name. The results were carefully curated. Philanthropist, real estate developer, self-made billionaire. Photos of him at charity galas, cutting ribbons at new buildings, shaking hands with politicians. But buried deeper, in forums and conspiracy sites, she found the other stories, the rumors. Adrian Blackwell wasn't just a businessman. He was allegedly the architect of New York's most sophisticated criminal organization, the Black Mafia. They dealt in everything: drugs, weapons, extortion, illegal gambling. But they did it so cleanly, so carefully, that law enforcement could never make anything stick. And Grace had saved his son. She'd entered his world, and now he was offering her a choice. Take the money and stay silent, or refuse and face consequences she couldn't even imagine. The bathroom door rattled. Grace, you okay in there? Rosie's voice carried genuine worry. Yeah, Grace called back, her voice steadier than she felt. Be right out. She stared at her reflection one more time. 26 years old, broke, alone, living a life of desperation that would probably kill her slowly, through stress, through exhaustion, through the grinding poverty that ate away at a person's soul one day at a time. Adrian Blackwell was offering her an escape. All she had to do was agree to forget everything she'd seen and heard last night, pretend that world didn't exist, take the money and build a better life. But if she did, what would she become? Could she really take blood money? Because that's what it was, regardless of how it was packaged, and live with herself. Grace unlocked the bathroom door and returned to the chaos of the lunch rush. She moved mechanically through her shift, smiling at customers, refilling coffee, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. At 7:45 p.m., after her shift ended, and she stood outside Rosie's diner in the gathering darkness, Grace pulled out the business card Vincent had left. A single phone number, no name, no other information. She had 15 minutes to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. Grace's finger hovered over her phone's keypad. Around her, Brooklyn moved through its evening routine. Cars honking, people shouting, the subway rumbling beneath the street. The same chaos as always, except now Grace saw it differently. She saw how fragile everything was, how quickly a life could change with one decision. She thought about Elijah's small hand in hers, his dark eyes that looked too old for his young face, the way Adrian had held him with such fierce gentleness. She thought about the photos in the envelope, the implicit threat. She thought about $500,000, and she thought about the person she wanted to be versus the person survival was forcing her to become. At 7:58 p.m., Grace dialed the number. It rang once before a voice answered. Not Vincent, not Marcus, Adrian Blackwell himself. Grace, he said, his deep voice resonant even through the phone. I'm glad you called. Grace took a breath, steadying herself. I have some conditions. There was a pause. Then something that might have been respect colored his tone. I'm listening. I want the money donated to Brooklyn Community Hospital, Grace said, the words coming out in a rush before she could change her mind. The pediatric ward. They took care of me when I was a kid and didn't have insurance. They save lives every day. That money will do more good there than in my bank account. Silence stretched across the line. Grace could almost feel Adrian recalculating his assessment of her. And in exchange? He finally asked. In exchange, I want a job, Grace said. Not with you. Nothing illegal, but something legitimate. Something where I can use my brain instead of just my ability to carry coffee. I want a chance to build something real. That's all? Adrian's voice carried notes of disbelief. That's all, Grace confirmed. I don't want your money, Mr. Blackwell. I don't want to be bought. But I do want an opportunity. Another long pause. Grace could hear something in the background. Classical music, maybe. It seemed incongruous with everything she knew about this man. You're either incredibly noble or incredibly stupid, Adrian said finally. I haven't decided which. Maybe both, Grace admitted. Why? Adrian asked, and the question felt genuine. Why turn down $500,000? Because I need to live with myself, Grace said simply. And I can't do that if I take money that comes from wherever your money comes from. You think you know where my money comes from? There was an edge to his voice now. I think I don't want to know, Grace replied honestly. I think I want to help that little boy by doing the right thing, and the right thing isn't profiting from his near death. Silence again. Grace wondered if she just made the worst mistake of her life. If refusing Adrian Blackwell's money was the same as signing her own death warrant. All right, Adrian said finally. I'll have Vincent contact you tomorrow with job opportunities. Legitimate ones. And I'll make the donation to the hospital in your name. Not in my name, Grace interrupted. Anonymous. I don't want recognition. Of course you don't, Adrian said, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice. You're an interesting woman, Grace Turner. Most people in your position would take the money and run. You're negotiating for charity and employment. Is that a problem? Grace asked. No, Adrian replied. It's refreshing. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Grace stood on the sidewalk, phone still pressed to her ear, wondering what the hell she'd just done. She'd turned down life-changing money and instead asked a possible crime lord for a job referral. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Unknown. Wise choice or foolish? Time will tell. A.B. Grace walked toward the subway, her mind spinning. She'd made her decision. Now she'd have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Brooklyn Community Hospital. 3 days later. 11:32 a.m. Grace stood in the lobby of Brooklyn Community Hospital, staring at a bronze plaque that hadn't existed 3 days ago. It was mounted on the wall near the pediatric ward entrance, polished and official-looking. In honor of anonymous donation, $500,000 dedicated to the children of Brooklyn, November 2024. He'd actually done it. Adrian Blackwell had taken the money he'd offered her and given it to the hospital, exactly as she'd requested. Grace traced her fingers over the cold metal, feeling the weight of that decision settle over her shoulders like a heavy coat. Grace Turner. She turned to find a woman in her 40s approaching, wearing a crisp navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio. Everything about her screamed professional, from her perfectly styled blonde hair to her calculated smile. I'm Rebecca Walsh, the woman said, extending her hand. Vincent sent me. I understand you're looking for employment opportunities? Grace shook her hand, noting the firm grip. That's right. Excellent. Let's talk somewhere more private, shall we? They settled into a corner table at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. Rebecca ordered a green tea. Grace got black coffee, the only thing she could reliably afford. Rebecca opened her portfolio, revealing several documents printed on expensive paper. I've reviewed your background, Rebecca began, her tone briskly efficient. Some college business administration major, left in your second year due to financial constraints. You've been working service industry jobs for the past 4 years. References indicate you're reliable, intelligent, and good with people. Grace nodded, unsure where this was going. Mr. Blackwell has several legitimate business enterprises, Rebecca continued. Blackwell Properties, his real estate development company. Blackwell Holdings, which manages various investments. And Blackwell Foundation, his charitable organization. All of these are completely legal, fully audited, and above board. The way she emphasized completely legal made Grace's skin prickle. It was the kind of statement that drew attention to itself precisely because it protested too much. I have 3 positions available, Rebecca said, sliding papers across the table. Junior Property Manager at Blackwell Properties, Administrative Assistant at Blackwell Holdings, or Coordinator at Blackwell Foundation. All 3 offer competitive salaries, benefits, and opportunities for advancement. Grace studied the job descriptions. The salaries ranged from $50,000 to $60,000 annually, more than double what she made at Rosie's. The benefits included health insurance, which she hadn't had since she was 18. It looked perfect. Too perfect. What's the catch? Grace asked. Rebecca's professional smile didn't waver. No catch. Mr. Blackwell values loyalty and competence. You demonstrated both by saving his son and by refusing his initial offer. He believes you'd be an asset to his legitimate operations. And if I take one of these jobs, what does he expect in return? Your work, Rebecca replied simply, and your continued discretion about your interaction with his family, nothing more. Grace wanted to believe that. She desperately wanted to believe she could take this job, escape her crushing poverty, and not be drawn deeper into whatever world Adrian Blackwell really inhabited. But her instincts warned her that nothing was ever this simple. Can I think about it? Grace asked. Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, you have until Monday, that's 4 days from now. She closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. But Grace, let me be clear about something. Mr. Blackwell doesn't make offers like this often. Refusing this one would be unwise. There it was, the velvet glove slipping just enough to reveal the iron fist underneath. I understand, Grace said quietly. After Rebecca left, Grace sat alone with her coffee and the job descriptions, feeling trapped. She'd thought turning down the money would free her from Adrian's world. Instead, she'd just changed the terms of her involvement. Now he was offering her legitimate employment, but the implicit message was clear. Work for him or face consequences. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, though by now Grace was starting to recognize the pattern. Unknown. Elijah keeps asking about you. He wants to say thank you properly. Tomorrow 2 p.m., Central Park near Bethesda Fountain. Just you and him. No pressure. A.B. Grace stared at the message. This was manipulation, obviously, using the child to pull her closer. But it was also a little boy who wanted to see the person who'd saved his life. Could she really say no to that? Against her better judgment, Grace typed back, I'll be there. Central Park. Saturday, 1:55 p.m. Central Park in November was beautiful in a melancholy way. The trees had lost most of their leaves, creating skeletal silhouettes against the gray sky. Tourists still crowded the pathways, taking selfies and feeding overpriced hot dogs to pigeons. Grace walked toward Bethesda Fountain, her hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets against the cold. She spotted them before they spotted her. Elijah sat on a bench near the fountain, bundled in an expensive-looking winter coat, his small legs swinging back and forth. Adrian stood nearby, hands in the pockets of a long black overcoat, watching his son with an expression Grace had never seen on his face before, something soft and unguarded. Marcus and 2 other security personnel were positioned at strategic points around the area, trying and failing to look inconspicuous. Grace counted at least 4 more guards scattered throughout the crowd. Adrian Blackwell didn't go anywhere without an army. Elijah saw her first. His face lit up with a smile that made Grace's heart ache. Grace! He shouted, jumping off the bench and running toward her. Grace caught him as he launched himself at her legs, hugging her with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. Hey, kiddo, she said softly. How are you doing? I'm good. Elijah pulled back, looking up at her with those 2 old eyes. Daddy says you didn't want the reward money. How come? Grace glanced at Adrian, who had moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. Because saving you was the right thing to do, she told Elijah. You don't get paid for doing the right thing. But Daddy said you're not rich, Elijah said with the brutal honesty of children. Don't you need money? Elijah, Adrian's voice carried a warning note. It's okay, Grace said quickly. Yes, I could use money, but there are more important things than money, like making sure little boys don't get hit by cars. Elijah seemed to consider this seriously. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. I made you something, he said shyly. At school, for art class. Grace unwrapped the tissue to find a clay figurine, painted in bright colors. It was roughly shaped like a person with long hair and a cape, clearly meant to be her. The craftsmanship was exactly what you'd expect from a 5-year-old, which made it perfect. You're a superhero, Elijah explained. Because you saved me. See? That's your cape. Grace's throat tightened with emotion. This is the best gift anyone's ever given me, she said honestly. Thank you, Elijah. The boy beamed with pride. Daddy, can Grace have lunch with us? Please? Adrian looked at Grace, his expression unreadable. If Grace would like to join us, she's welcome. It wasn't really a question. Grace found herself nodding. Okay, lunch sounds nice. They walked to Tavern on the Green, the famous restaurant overlooking the park. Grace felt wildly out of place as they were immediately seated despite the crowd of people waiting. The host treated Adrian with the kind of deference usually reserved for heads of state. Other diners turned to look, whispering behind their hands. Elijah chattered happily throughout lunch, telling Grace about his school, his favorite cartoons, his pet hamster named Professor Squeaks. He was just a normal kid, sweet and funny and full of life. It was easy to forget who his father was when listening to Elijah's rambling stories about kindergarten drama. Adrian remained mostly quiet, watching their interaction with that same analytical intensity. Grace could feel his gaze on her constantly, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle she represented. When Elijah excused himself to use the bathroom accompanied by Marcus, Adrian finally spoke. "He likes you," Adrian said. "That's rare. Elijah doesn't trust easily. I wonder where he learned that," Grace replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Adrian's lips curved slightly. "You're angry with me. For the job offer. You think I'm manipulating you, aren't you?" Grace challenged. "Yes," Adrian admitted bluntly, "but not for the reasons you think. I'm not trying to buy your silence, Grace. You proved you won't be bought. I'm offering you employment because you're intelligent, principled, and you demonstrated remarkable courage. Those qualities are valuable, rare. In your line of work?" Grace asked pointedly. Adrian's eyes darkened. "Careful." "Why?" Grace leaned forward. "What are you going to do if I ask questions? Threaten me? Make me disappear? I already know you're dangerous, Mr. Blackwell. Everyone knows it, even if they can't prove it." "If everyone knows it, why are you here?" Adrian countered. "Why did you come to meet Elijah? Why are you considering my job offer? You could have walked away, refused everything, gone back to your safe, struggling life, but you didn't." Grace opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. He was right. She'd had multiple opportunities to cut all ties with Adrian Blackwell, and she'd chosen not to. "Why?" "Because of him," Grace finally said, gesturing toward where Elijah had disappeared. "Because that kid deserves to have good people around him. People who might remind him that not everything has to be solved with money and threats." Adrian studied her for a long moment. "You think you can save him, from me, from my world? Someone should try," Grace said quietly. "And what about you?" Adrian asked. "Who saves you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Grace didn't want to examine too closely. Elijah returned, mercifully ending the conversation. He climbed back into his chair and resumed eating his chicken fingers, oblivious to the tension between the adults. After lunch, as they walked back toward the fountain, Elijah took Grace's hand. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Grace looked at Adrian, who watched them with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Would you like that?" she asked Elijah. "Yes," Elijah said emphatically. "You're nice, and you don't treat me like I'm weird because my daddy's famous." "You're not weird," Grace assured him. "You're wonderful. So you'll come back?" Elijah pressed. Grace knelt down to his level. "I'll try, okay? But I can't promise. Sometimes grown-up stuff is complicated." Elijah seemed to accept this. He hugged her tightly, then ran back to Marcus, leaving Grace alone with Adrian. "He doesn't have many people he connects with," Adrian said quietly. "His mother died when he was 2. Car accident. Since then, it's been mostly just me and the security team. Not exactly a normal childhood." Grace heard the pain beneath the words, the guilt of a father who knew his lifestyle was stealing his son's innocence. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "Take the job," Adrian said abruptly. "Not because I'm ordering you to. Not because you're afraid of consequences. Take it because you could make a difference. In my legitimate businesses, yes, but also in Elijah's life. He needs someone like you." "Someone like me?" Grace repeated. "Someone good," Adrian said simply. "Someone who does the right thing even when it costs them. Someone who reminds people like me that there's more to life than power and control." Grace looked at this man who terrified her, intrigued her, and somehow made her want to believe he was more than the monster everyone whispered about. "And if I take the job and discover things I shouldn't, what then?" "Then you'll have a choice to make," Adrian replied honestly. "Just like you're making now. I won't lie to you, Grace. My world is complicated, dangerous. But the offer I'm making is genuine. Work for me, help Elijah, and I promise you'll be protected, valued, given opportunities to build the life you want." "Protected from what?" Grace asked. "From you?" Adrian's expression hardened. "From everyone else. You entered my world when you saved Elijah. That made you visible to people who might want to use you against me. People far more dangerous than I am. The safest place for you now is close enough that I can keep you safe. Ice water flooded Grace's veins. You're saying I'm in danger because I helped your son? I'm saying the world noticed you, Adrian corrected. And in my world, being noticed is dangerous. But being under my protection is not. Grace felt the trap closing around her. She'd thought she was making noble choices, staying principled, keeping her distance from Adrian's darker dealings. But she'd been naive. The moment she'd grabbed Elijah on that rainy street, she'd stepped onto a board game where she didn't know the rules and all the other players were far more experienced. This isn't a choice at all, is it? Grace said bitterly. You're telling me I have to work for you for my own safety. I'm telling you the reality of the situation, Adrian replied. What you do with that information is still your choice, but I'd rather have you close where I can protect you than distant and vulnerable. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to go to hell, that she'd take her chances, that she didn't need protection from a man who was probably the source of the danger. But she looked at Marcus and the other guards positioned around them, remembered the photos Vincent had shown her, and understood the truth. She was already in this. The only question was whether she'd be in it with Adrian's protection or without it. The foundation job, Grace said finally. If I'm going to do this, I want to work somewhere that actually helps people. Adrian nodded slowly. The foundation it is. Rebecca will have the paperwork ready Monday morning. You start in 2 weeks. That gives you time to give notice at the diner. One condition, Grace added. I see Elijah regularly, not as an employee, as a friend, without guards hovering over every interaction. Adrian's jaw tightened. That's not non-negotiable, Grace interrupted. If you want me in your world, that's the price. That boy needs normalcy. He needs someone who isn't paid to be around him and isn't terrified of you. I can be that person, but only if you let me. Adrian stared at her, and Grace held his gaze, refusing to back down. Finally, he gave a short nod. Fine, but Marcus stays within range. Always. Deal, Grace said. They shook hands, and Grace felt the warmth of Adrian's palm against hers, a human connection that seemed impossible given everything else about him. Welcome to my world, Grace Turner, Adrian said quietly. Try not to let it destroy you. As Grace walked away from Central Park, the clay figurine of herself as a superhero clutched in her hands, she wondered if it was already too late for that warning. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and somehow she knew there were many more lines ahead. Blackwell Foundation, 2 weeks later, 9:15 a.m. Grace's first day at the Blackwell Foundation felt surreal. The office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of building where even the air felt expensive. Her cubicle had better furniture than her entire apartment, and the coffee in the break room was imported from Italy. Grace Turner, a woman in her 30s, approached carrying a stack of folders. I'm Diana Chen, program director. Welcome to the team. Diana was efficient, warm, and genuinely passionate about the foundation's work. She spent the morning walking Grace through their programs: scholarship funds for underprivileged students, grants for community health clinics, support for arts education in public schools. Everything was meticulously documented, transparently managed, and as far as Grace could tell, completely legitimate. Mr. Blackwell takes the foundation very seriously, Diana explained as they toured the facilities. He believes in giving back to communities that built him. Everything we do here is above board. We're audited quarterly by independent firms. Grace noticed how Diana emphasized above board, the same way Rebecca had, as if they all needed to constantly remind people, or perhaps themselves, that this part of Adrian's empire was clean. Does Mr. Blackwell come here often? Grace asked carefully. Rarely, Diana admitted. He trusts us to run operations. He reviews quarterly reports and approves major grants, but day-to-day management is ours. She paused, studying Grace with curious eyes. Though I heard he personally requested you for this position. That's unusual. Grace felt heat creep up her neck. I helped his son. He was grateful. Must have been some help, Diana murmured, but she smiled. Well, we're glad to have you. We need someone to coordinate our youth mentorship program. Think you're up for it? Absolutely, Grace said, meaning it. The work was challenging but fulfilling. Grace spent her days connecting at-risk teenagers with mentors, organizing workshops, securing funding for after-school programs. It was everything she'd hoped for, meaningful work that actually helped people. For the first time in years, Grace felt like her life had purpose beyond simply surviving. But Adrian's shadow loomed over everything. 3 weeks later, 6:47 p.m., Grace was leaving the office when Marcus appeared in the lobby, as if he'd materialized from thin air. "Miss Turner," he said formally. "Mr. Blackwell requests your presence." Grace's stomach tightened. She hadn't seen Adrian since that day in Central Park, though Elijah had visited her apartment twice, always with Marcus lurking nearby. The boy was sweet, funny, and increasingly attached to her, which made everything more complicated. "Now?" Grace asked. "Now." The SUV took her to an address in Tribeca, not Blackwell Tower, but a converted warehouse that screamed money trying to look casual. Marcus led her through a private entrance to a rooftop terrace overlooking the Hudson River. Adrian stood by the railing, dressed in dark jeans and a black sweater, more casual than Grace had ever seen him. He looked almost human. Almost. "Thank you for coming," Adrian said without turning around. "Did I have a choice?" Grace replied. Now he turned, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Always. I keep telling you that, and I keep not believing you." Grace approached the railing, maintaining careful distance. The city stretched below them, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled. "Why am I here, Adrian?" "Elijah's birthday is next week," Adrian said. "He wants you there. I wanted to ask personally." Grace blinked. "You summoned me across the city to invite me to a 6-year-old's birthday party?" "I don't summon," Adrian corrected. "I request." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Grace challenged. Adrian's expression darkened. "You've been working at the foundation for 3 weeks. Has anyone threatened you? Followed you? Made you feel unsafe?" "No," Grace admitted. "Have I interfered with your work? Made unreasonable demands? Treated you as anything other than a valued employee?" "No," Grace said again, quieter. "Then perhaps you could stop treating me like a monster," Adrian said, and for the first time Grace heard something like hurt in his voice. They stood in silence, the wind carrying the sounds of the city up to their isolated perch. Grace studied Adrian's profile, the sharp angles of his face, the tension in his shoulders, the carefully controlled power that radiated from him even in stillness. "I don't think you're a monster," Grace finally said. "I think you're dangerous." "There's a difference." Adrian looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "Yes, there is." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the complicated truth they both danced around. Adrian Blackwell was dangerous. His world was built on foundations Grace didn't want to examine too closely, but he was also a father who loved his son, a man who honored his word, and someone who had kept his promise to protect her. "I'll come to the party," Grace said softly. "For Elijah." "Just for Elijah?" Adrian asked, and there was something in his voice that made Grace's heart skip. "Yes," Grace lied. "Just for Elijah." But as Marcus drove her home through the glittering Manhattan night, Grace couldn't stop thinking about the way Adrian had looked at her on that rooftop, like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve, but wasn't sure he should. And she couldn't stop thinking about how she'd looked back. Blackwell Estate, Long Island, Saturday, 3:42 p.m. Elijah's birthday party was nothing like Grace expected. She'd imagined something ostentatious, ponies, magicians, a guest list of Manhattan's elite. Instead, she found herself at Adrian's Long Island estate, watching 6 kindergartners destroy a bounce house while eating pizza. Surprised? Adrian appeared beside her holding 2 glasses of lemonade. He wore jeans and a simple button-down, sleeves rolled up. Almost normal. Almost. "Very," Grace admitted, accepting the drink. "I expected more. Extravagance. Elijah's 6. He doesn't care about extravagance." Adrian watched his son tackle another boy in the bounce house, both of them laughing hysterically. "He just wants to be a regular kid. I try to give him that when I can." Grace saw the longing in Adrian's expression, a father's desperate wish to give his child a normal life while knowing that was impossible. Grace. Elijah ran up, breathless and grinning. "Did you see me? I did a flip." "I saw. Very impressive." Grace laughed as Elijah hugged her, then ran back to his friends. The party continued with cake, presents, and controlled chaos. Grace helped serve food alongside Adrian's house staff, all of whom treated her with cautious respect. She noticed Marcus and other security personnel stationed discreetly around the property, a reminder that even this innocent celebration existed under armed guard. As the sun began to set and parents arrived to collect their children, Adrian found Grace standing on the terrace overlooking the sound. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "It meant a lot to Elijah, and to me." Grace turned to face him. "Adrian, can I ask you something?" "Always." "What do you want from me?" "Really?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening water. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight Grace hadn't heard before. "My father built an empire on blood and fear," Adrian began. "When he died, I inherited it all. The power, the reputation, the enemies. I've spent 15 years maintaining that empire because it's what I know. It's what I'm good at. But Elijah," his voice cracked slightly, "Elijah deserves better than this world. Better than me." "You're a good father," Grace said softly. "Am I?" Adrian's laugh was bitter. "I've killed people, Grace. Ordered deaths. Destroyed lives. I've done things that would make you run screaming if you knew the details. What kind of father brings that darkness home to his child?" Grace's breath caught. He was admitting it, finally speaking the truth they'd both danced around. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, to run from this confession. But another part, the part that had watched him gently wipe frosting from Elijah's face, kept her rooted in place. "Then why not leave?" Grace asked. "Walk away from it all." "Because it doesn't work that way," Adrian said harshly. "You don't retire from my position. You die in it or you die trying to escape it. The people I've crossed, the deals I've made, they don't come with exit clauses." "But you want out," Grace said, understanding dawning. Adrian looked at her, and for the first time she saw past his armor to the man underneath, trapped, tired, and desperately searching for redemption he didn't believe he deserved. "I want Elijah to have choices I never had," Adrian said. "I want him to grow up knowing there's another way to live. That's what you represent, Grace. You're proof that goodness still exists, that courage doesn't require violence. Elijah sees that in you. And honestly, so do I." Grace's heart hammered. "Adrian, I'm not asking you to save me," Adrian interrupted. "I'm too far gone for that. But maybe you can help save him. Keep being the person you are. Show Elijah that not everyone solves problems with money or threats, that there are people in this world worth becoming." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "You're not too far gone. Nobody is." Adrian smiled sadly. "You have more faith in people than they deserve. It's one of your better qualities." He paused. "And one of your more dangerous ones." Before Grace could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Sir, we have a situation." Adrian's entire demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerable father disappeared, replaced by the cold strategist. "What kind?" "Castillo's crew. They hit one of our warehouses in Queens. 3 men dead." Grace watched Adrian's face harden into something terrifying. This was the man people whispered about, the one who ruled through calculated violence. "Get Elijah inside. Full lockdown protocols," Adrian ordered. He turned to Grace. "Marcus will take you home. Now." "What's happening?" Grace demanded. "Nothing you need to worry about," Adrian said, already moving toward the house. "Marcus," but Grace grabbed his arm. "Don't shut me out. Not after what you just told me." Adrian looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "This is my world, Grace. The part you don't want to see. The part that proves I'm exactly what everyone says I am." "I'm not running," Grace said firmly. "Not from you. Not from the truth. You should," Adrian said quietly, "before it's too late." But they both knew it already was.